Good afternoon to all, and welcome to our second day of the FEEDNETICS webinar for academic users. And just before we start, just a bit of housekeeping for the newcomers, if there are newcomers. So yesterday we had a first talk for an overview of the FEEDNETICS concept, and then followed with some use cases by Luís Conceição. And today we are going to have in just 1 minute Tomé Silva explaining a bit more in detail the modeling approach, and afterwards Filipe Soares will give you a live demo just to have a grasp of how the web app looks like. And so with no more delays, I will put Tomé Silva in the spotlight. And just one note, please use the Q&A button while Tomé is talking. If you have any questions, use your Q&A button and we'll address those in the second part of the webinar.
So hi everyone, good afternoon. As Anna said, I'm going to talk a bit about the reasoning for the FEEDNETICS application and the model that powers the FEEDNETICS application. And it's a good idea to consider as a starting point, why do we need to predict fish growth in the first place? One important reason for that is to address questions related to feeding. So to decide how much feed we give to a fish in a given day, we generally use a feeding table as a reference, but to do so, we need to have an idea of how much total fish we have. And this is something that can be measured, but you cannot really measure every day. So in between the measurements, you have to somehow be able to predict things. Furthermore, if you want to do some sort of more long-term planning of your feed and feeding, you need to be able to predict how much biomass you're going to have in the future. And this is something that you cannot measure, you must somehow predict. Another important reason is to be able to predict the effect of changes in diet formulation. So as we all know, there are different pressures that have continuously driven the replacement of fish meal in fish oil, classical marine ingredients, by other alternative ingredients. And the truth is that this higher variability in the type of ingredients and feedstuffs used also has led to a higher variability in the nutritional profiles of diets. And as such, there's always a risk of nutritional deficiencies or imbalances. And so in general, there's like, let's say, two main uses for fish growth prediction tools. One of them is one side of it is the more practical use cases, for example, to manage feed and feeding. But also you can use fish growth models for more theoretical purposes. So for example, to test and compare different scenarios, to optimize your rearing conditions, or to benchmark, meaning to compare reality against the expectations, let's say. Besides fish growth, it's also important in aquaculture to be able to predict fish composition. And the reason is mostly to the fact that you need to have some information here if you want to be able to say something about fish nutritional value or about the environmental impact of rearing activities. But putting this aspect aside for a moment and focusing on the issue of fish growth, the next question is, recognizing that it's important, how do we predict fish growth? And so it's good to start by considering that fish growth as a process is something that depends strongly on three factors: nutrient or energy intake, temperature, and fish size. On the other hand, we know that fish growth is also affected by many other factors, such as photoperiod, pH, salinity, and so on. And the issue is that all these different factors that affect fish growth, they're not independent between themselves, and they're not independent of the fish growth process itself. So we can say that fish growth as a process is something very complex. The solution to address this is to use models, and models are simplified mathematical descriptions of a process that may be very complicated. In the context of fish growth prediction, there are many different types of models that people use with differing levels of complexity, from very simple models based on concepts such as growth rate or feed conversion ratio or thermal growth coefficient, to more complex models based on bioenergetic principles or nutrient-based models. One thing that we have to have into account is that all models, since there are simplifications of reality, they always display some level of limitations, limitations. And one thing to have into account is that the more simple models tend to be more limited, so they fail to account for nutritional effects, for instance. And so when we choose between simple models or complex models, there's always a trade-off that we have to do, since simple models and complex models have their own advantages and disadvantages. And those simple models have, of course, the advantages of being easy to use and calibrate and implement and so on. Complex models have the potential to give you better predictions and particularly to model the effects of nutritional factors. On the other hand, when we look at the practice in aquaculture and aquaculture research in general, we see that simple models are much more prevalent than complex models. And the reason for this is, of course, complex models are not easy to implement and not easy to calibrate. And having identified this issue, FEEDNETICS was basically developed to try to address this issue. So as you've heard yesterday and even today, FEEDNETICS is a decision support tool that takes advantage of nutrient-based modeling, and it's in practice it's a web application, and the user interacts with the application through a user interface. After my presentation, Filipe will show you a bit about the FEEDNETICS user interface and how you can use it in practice. But now we'll talk specifically about the model that's inside the FEEDNETICS web application. So as I said, this model is a nutrient-based model, and like all nutrient-based models, it follows a certain logic, which is you have to feed nutrients to the model, then the model inside will convert between the nutrients and separate basically a fraction of the nutrients that will be retained and another fraction of the nutrients that will be lost. And an important characteristic of nutrient-based models is that they are developed to ensure that, for example, energy conservation and mass conservation are respected. And this means that if you feed the fish with an amount of nutrients equivalent, for example, to 10 kilojoule of energy, for sure the model will never retain more than 10 kilojoules of nutrients. And this characteristic ensures that the predictions are at least physically reasonable. Simple models cannot ensure this. So in this sense, nutrient-based models give you some assurance that at least the predictions are physically reasonable. Looking into more detail at the FEEDNETICS model in specific, and here looking at it from a high-level view, we can see that the FEEDNETICS model is mostly driven by three inputs: temperature, feed quantity, and feed properties in terms of macro and micronutrient composition. And then the model itself is separated into three compartments: the gut, the blood, and the body. And in this body compartment is where the metabolic reactions are modeled, let's say. As the output of this model, you have body weight and the composition in different nutrients, and from these outputs you can then calculate other useful outputs. Looking at the metabolic processes that are modeled in this body compartment, we basically, besides modeling the central metabolism, let's say, FEEDNETICS explicitly models amino acid metabolism to some level of detail, meaning the interconversion between the different amino acids is explicitly modeled, while in the case of the fatty acid model, the model is relatively more simple, but this approximation works fairly well for marine species, at least. Finally, it's important to look at FEEDNETICS predictions. There's a phrase by an important statistician, which is that all models are wrong, but some are useful. And what this means is that you shouldn't expect any model to give you perfect predictions, not only because models are simplifications of reality, but also because whatever errors you provide in the inputs are going to be propagated to the output. So you cannot expect perfect predictions unless you're providing perfect inputs as well. On the other hand, a model has to give you reasonable predictions, otherwise it cannot ever be useful. And we went to great lengths to ensure that, to validate the model and to ensure that indeed the predictions are reasonable. Looking a bit in more detail, for example, we consider that the model could not be useful unless it's able to reasonably predict the outcome of nutritional trials. So giving you some examples, if we try to simulate a trial where different levels of fat were tested in diets for rainbow trout, what we see is that although of course the predictions are not perfect, we see that the trend that was observed in this publication is also accurately replicated by FEEDNETICS. Another example, now in terms of micronutrients, when we try to replicate what happened in a trial where we had 4 diets with the same macro composition but with differing levels of methionine, what we see is that if we try to simulate what happened using a simple nutrient-based model that only has into account macronutrients, we see that the overall shape of the growth curves is more or less correct, but there's not much difference between the tanks because they had diets with the same macronutrients. The only difference that we see is actually due to the differences in feed intake. On the other hand, if we simulate exactly the same situation, but with a model that has into account the intake levels of amino acids, like FEEDNETICS model, we see that it much more accurately reproduces the individual per tank growth curves. We tested in other examples, for example, trying different vegetable protein concentrates with different amino acid profiles, or testing completely different formulations. And the conclusion that we reach is that regardless of what we change, FEEDNETICS seems useful because it is able to reasonably predict the effects of changing all these nutritional factors. And so effectively, we see that FEEDNETICS can be useful not only at the level of trial design before you start the trial to help you decide what you should test in the first place, but also in terms of trial benchmarking. So after you run the trial, to try to interpret the results of your trial. Did they grow as you would expect? If not, why? Is it some factor that the model is not taking into account? So basically, you can use the model for, since it predicts accurately or reasonably the outcome of nutritional trials, it is a useful model. Another aspect is long-term predictions, and this is a much more challenging situation because errors in fish growth prediction models are cumulative. So as you predict over time and as you extrapolate growth over time, the errors tend to accumulate. We have also validated the FEEDNETICS in such contexts, and what we see is that, in fact, FEEDNETICS is able to provide really good long-term predictions, even in a situation where fish are being subjected to many different diets sequentially. Furthermore, if we've also tried to replicate long-term trials from the literature, and this is again particularly challenging because the data that we used are quite noisy in the sense that we do not have precise daily resolution information on the temperature and feed intake. So it's good to see that the long-term predictions are actually still quite reasonable. And so, as I said, having seen that FEEDNETICS is able to provide decent long-term predictions in many different contexts, we can with confidence say that it is also a useful tool that you can use before you start the trial to try to address more practical questions of how to set up your trial. And as we already seen, it can be useful to help you manage how you'll do not only the feeding on a day-to-day basis, but to plan how much feed you need before you start your trial. So the overall take-home message of this presentation is first that the FEEDNETICS application is powered by a nutrient-based model that can predict nutritional effects. And the use of predictive models, in particular nutrient-based models like FEEDNETICS, is useful even for research in aquaculture, since it can, on one hand, help you improve on your some practical aspects of feed management and trial setup, help you to test hypotheses and refine your experimental designs, but also for benchmarking and to help you interpret your results. So the general idea that we want to pass is not that you should use models to replace fish trials, but you should definitely use models to take better advantage of the fish trials that you already do. So having said this, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A function, and I guess I can pass the word to her.
Thank you very much, Tomé. I think this was a nice overview of what is under the hood of FEEDNETICS and how confident you can be for complement your research. And finally, we will listen to Filipe and follow the live demo he will provide, so you can have a look into the real aspect of into the practical aspect and looks of the web app. Just before we move to Filipe, just let me thank you all that already replied to the polls. Yesterday, you also had answered to most of the polls. Thank you for that. Just after Filipe presents the live demo, we will relaunch the poll for the registration for the 3-day demo, just in case we have newcomers or you didn't had the opportunity yesterday to register. And so, with no more delays, I will give the spotlight to Filipe.
Okay, thank you, Anna, and good afternoon, everyone. So, as already mentioned, FEEDNETICS is implemented as a web application. So this means that it can be accessed in any browser by means of a user account. As this tool is intended to be used both by fish farmers, aquafeed formulators, and now by researchers, we try to design it in order to cover the needs of these different types of users, but without compromising the usability and also the user-friendliness of its interface. So this means that the user can run simulations with more or less detailed input data, and also opt to explore the results in a deep or superficial way. This tool is flexible in that respect. So to explore scenarios in FEEDNETICS in macro view, let's say, it is usually necessary to go through 3 steps. In the first step, all the input data that is required to run all the simulations must be inserted. Then, in the second step, all the simulations must be defined and run. And in the third step, all the results should be explored in order to draw some conclusions. As you can see in this left sidebar, the input data relates essentially to the farming conditions, to the properties of the feeds under evaluation, to the feeding regime, which is in here defined as the type and amount of feeds to be provided over the simulation period, and the temperature profile. As an example, in FEEDNETICS, the input data can be inserted in 2 different ways. For instance, if I want to insert data about the proximal composition of this feed, the feed A, I can do it directly in the web application by inserting the values in these cells over here, or I can simply export an Excel file, fill it in with data, and then import it again into FEEDNETICS. However, there are some cases, it is the example of the temperature profile, that in which the inputs can only be inserted through an Excel file. And let me show you the Excel file. Okay, is this one. And this is because the user can choose the level of detail of the input data. In this specific case, I inserted data with daily resolution. However, I could also have inserted data with weekly or monthly resolution. In FEEDNETICS, it's always up to the user to choose the most convenient option. Okay, so after inserting all the input data that is required to run the different simulations, the second step in FEEDNETICS is to define the simulations. A simulation is defined as a combination of the different input data items that together represents a given scenario. For instance, this simulation over here, the simulation cage 1 feed C, represents, and let me open the settings page. This one represents Gilthead seabream being farmed under the farming conditions of cage 1, being fed under the feeding regime of feed C, and being subjected to the temperature profile of site A. And the simulation has a simulation period of 1 year. So after defining all the input data that comprise this simulation, the following step is to run the simulation by clicking on this button. Usually it takes more or less 2 to 3 minutes to run a single simulation. So if you want to run, for instance, 10 simulations, it takes more or less half an hour. So I would say that in half a day, like in the morning or in the afternoon, you are able to test different scenarios, and you're able to do, for instance, diet pre-screening in order to refine your experimental design. So it's really a quick process to do that. So after performing all simulations, the third and most exciting step is the results exploration. In FEEDNETICS, the results can also be explored in 2 different ways. So the first option is direct indication, where the indicator can visualize testing the categories in this top bar. There is a total of 6 different categories and more than 100 indicators to explore. For instance, if I want to visualize the average body weight, I just have to open the category stock and then choose the respective indicator from the drop-down menu. Just have to wait a bit. Okay, and select the indicator. And as you can see, you'll be able to visualize the values over time on mouse over, and also to see this graph line. So the second option to export the results in FEEDNETICS is by exporting an Excel file, which we call the book of reports. So this file allows a maximum of 5 simulations to be exported. Let me show you the example of the file. And it also allows for a more detailed comparison and analysis of the different simulations. And it presents the advantage of allowing the user to quickly compare through this summary table a set of indicators to quickly conclude what is the best scenario. For instance, in this specific case, I can quickly conclude that feeding cage 1 with feed B results in a lower FCR comparing to feeding cage 1 with feed A or feed C. Furthermore, this file also presents 2 more sheets. One of them is the results exploration, which allows the user to visualize multiple indicators at the same time in the charts over here, and also allows the user to compare one indicator against the other. Here is the case of the chart number 1, which presents a comparison between the average body weight against the FCR. And so the last sheets of this file, it presents all the results of all the indicators. Again, you can visualize more than 100 indicators, and this allows the user to copy the values to further analyze or display them in a customized way. And so, just to conclude this presentation, I would like also to mention that FEEDNETICS presents a help section, which includes a quick start guide, which can be downloaded, and a series of short video tutorials to help the user at the start. So with this support, it's really easy to learn how to use FEEDNETICS by your own. And I think that my internet connection is a bit weak right now, but yeah, but that's all from my side.
Thank you very much, Filipe. I think we might have some interferences, but it was, at least for me, I just noticed for the end. But if any of the participants might have any issue, just let us know and we'll try to complement as possible. And so with this, I think we have a nice wrap up about what is FEEDNETICS and how you can use it for. And just like yesterday, we will now go to the Q&A session. And we already have, let me, just before we do that, let me thank you very much for answering the polling. And don't forget, we are going to launch the poll for your registration for the 3-day, for those of you that are interested, of course, and for those of you that did not register yesterday. If you did, just you don't need to do anything else. And so let's go to the questions. So by now we have 2 questions. And the first is by Renata Gonçalves. Is this tool expected to become applicable to crustacean species in the near future? So Luís Conceição, maybe you can reply to Renata, please.
Yes, of course. At the moment, FEEDNETICS is not prepared to deal with crustacean species, but of course it will be possible to do it in the future. We are studying that possibility, and if some of you are interested in collaborating with us on that endeavor, we will be happy to talk with you about that. This because, I mean, as Tomé explained you, FEEDNETICS is based on intermediary metabolism, and intermediary metabolism is common to all animals with minor modifications and minor specificities, crustaceans and vertebrates. So it should be possible. Of course, there will have to be some adaptations to the model. But then the most important thing, if we want to have FEEDNETICS working, we must have good data to build the calibration of the model. I mean, I'm not sure if it's clear for all of you, but FEEDNETICS is basically a set of equations and has some dozens of parameters, probably a few hundred of parameters. Many of these parameters, they are derived from bibliography. Some are just biochemical constants. Many of them are just biochemical constants. But some others, they are not easy to calculate experimentally. So what we do is that we use data sets. So data sets with the fish or shrimp growth in this case. And we would need to have data sets on growth, but also on body composition, accompanied by very accurate records on feed intake and on temperature. If you would have this, a good number of data sets on this for shrimp or other crustacean, it should be relatively easy to make FEEDNETICS to work for a crustacean species.
Thank you, Louise. I was muted, sorry. We now have another question from Tomás Aires. Does FEEDNETICS considers the natural fed input in systems such as biofloc, earth ponds, or IMTA systems? Well, Tomás, FEEDNETICS, we just considers as feed inputs, whatever you introduce as input. So just the straightforward answer is no. But saying that, and let's look into each of these cases independently. If you have a biofloc system, what it might help you to do is, if you are doing, for instance, a trial with different levels of biofloc, so you start, for instance, clear water, then incrementing the biofloc concentration, what you can do is, by looking into your trial results and comparing the FEEDNETICS outputs, considering the feed inputs that you gave, you can look into the difference between FCR and gross that was estimated and that you obtained. And with that, you can estimate the role of the biofloc in the feeding of I don't know which species we're thinking about, maybe tilapia, maybe shrimp. We don't have for those yet, but maybe tilapia surely in the near future, shrimp maybe in a more distant future. But if you remember, I don't know if you were yesterday, if you remember one of the cases that, use cases that we showed, I think it was the second use case for the different gain results, different different treatments. You had a lag between the estimated growth by FEEDNETICS and what was the growth in the trial, and that lag was giving you, in that case, anti-nutritional factors, other things that are not being simulated. So in this case, the lag between your estimated growth by FEEDNETICS and the real growth that you are obtaining at your biofloc system, which should be, we would expect to be higher, that lag will give you the strength of your biofloc. You could use in such a way. This is just an idea. And regarding IMTA systems, if we are talking for the extractive component, let's say you have shellfish or macroalgae, and in the fed component you might have another fish species, what you can do, you will not have whatever is coming from the extractive species to the fish, but what you can use FEEDNETICS for is to estimate the wastes that are actually being used as inputs for the extractive species, the algae, the nutrients for the algae, or the solids for the shellfish. And actually for that we have a presentation, a work that we did and did present it on a conference last year at Aquaculture Europe, illustrating how FEEDNETICS can be used in such systems. And if you are interested, just throw us an email and we'll send you that presentation. Hope that this answered to you. And now coming back to Reda Saleh, and I hope I did pronounce it properly. Is FEEDNETICS the first app in the field of animal nutrition that simulates nutritional trials? And if yes, I want to express my deep congratulations to all of you for this great idea and wish all the success. This is Louise maybe might comment this question and comment, and thank you very much, Reda. Louise?
Yes, thank you, Reda, for the question. And in fish nutrition, it's the first web app which is available to a wider public or number of users. However, there are there are a number of mostly more or less elaborated Excel files that some people have used in the past, especially fulminates. And also, I'm not sure if they are web apps, but there is a number of software solutions that are being used and have been used in the past for nutrition of other animals, namely for poultry. Actually, I think poultry was the first industry to use this kind of modeling approaches in the more consistent way. But in pig nutrition and also in beef and in poultry, they are also being used. There are also solutions for that. But we believe that for fish, FEEDNETICS is highly innovative. Not the model itself. There are other models. You can find some in the algorithm. There are a number of algorithms which have been published in literature by different people in Norway, in the Netherlands, in Canada, and other places. But an algorithm which is translated into software which is made available for a wider public and which it's relatively easy to use. I think in that we are innovative.
Sorry, I was muted again. Thank you very much. We will move to the next. It's coming. Next question is coming from Neda, and it goes like, does FEEDNETICS predict the fish performance in terms of fish growth as an example, with variable temperature over time? For example, seasonal changes, given that the user should define the site temperature at the beginning of the simulation? And Filipe, maybe you can answer to this question?
Yes, sure. Hi, Neda. Thanks for your question. I don't know if you had the opportunity to see the input data file that I showed during my live tour of FEEDNETICS. Probably don't, because my internet connection was a bit poor at the moment. But FEEDNETICS allows the user to insert data with different levels of detail. So you can insert the temperature profile to be simulated by FEEDNETICS with daily resolution, weekly resolution, or with monthly resolution. So yes, the FEEDNETICS predicts the fish performance in terms of fish growth, also in terms of fish composition, like the fat or the protein retention over time, and also the fatty acids, having into consideration that fluctuations and variations in the temperature profile over time. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Filipe. Next question is from Edward Royer. Hello, Edward. You focused a lot on FEEDNETICS use for growth prediction, but would it also be useful for environmental impact assessment using the waste output of the model? Was it calibrated also with respect to these parameters? And Tomé, maybe you want to answer to this question?
Yes, yes. We agree that FEEDNETICS and modeling tools in general can be very useful for environmental impact assessment. And you can use FEEDNETICS for that. The model has not been explicitly calibrated with respect to these parameters, but because it is a nutritional model that partitions things into retained and let's say waste, and because we have calibrated explicitly with respect to the retained part, by difference, the waste should also be, if we're estimating correctly or at least reasonably the retention, then the waste should also be, in principle, reasonably well estimated. So hopefully that answers your question.
And next question is it possible to use FEEDNETICS tool for the diets based on different vitamin and mineral levels? And maybe you can answer to this also.
Yes,
please.
That's a very relevant question, and but I have to say that as of now, FEEDNETICS is not explicitly modeling vitamin and minerals apart from phosphorus. So, of course, you can use FEEDNETICS to simulate trials, but FEEDNETICS will always assume that your vitamin and mineral levels are at least adequate. So, trying to answer your question in a short way, the answer is no. As of now, no. Hopefully that addresses your question.
Can I just add something regarding still this question, which is, if you remember, use case number 3 that, if you were present yesterday, that Luís Conceição presented yesterday, it was actually for one case that if you had an ingredient or that showed differences in digestibility, and if that's the case, although you cannot test differences in vitamins as you were asking, but if you notice differences in some ingredients that you might not include as inputs for FEEDNETICS, but you notice these differences, for instance, in digestibilities, one thing you can do is to insert the differences in digestibility, and for instance, predict the long-term effects of those differences in different digestibilities. And so next question is coming from Leonardo. Hello, Leonardo. And the question is, I'm interested in the application of this software for research. Can be used, can I use this app to explore potential variability on feed intake between experimental units to design trials accordingly? Luís, maybe you can answer to this question.
Yes, sure. Thank you, Leonardo. That's an interesting question, actually, and this one we have not, at least I have not thought about it before. But the answer is yes, but you'll have to do it in a manual way, meaning that, I mean, you can define, you can simulate different feed intakes for with exactly the same feed, the same conditions, and see what the model will predict. So you can estimate by difference in feed intake between tanks, what will be the magnitude of the differences in the responses. Okay. But this is the way you can do it, because I mean FEEDNETICS, it's deterministic. So basically, it will give you one value. So if you say feed intake is 1, it will estimate how much of this over time. If feed intake is 1% per day, how much of this feed that the fish will consume, how much will be retained in the different tissues. And as the different nutrients, how much will be used for energy or excreted. But I mean, once you can change, you can run different simulations with different feed intakes, and you can simulate this. So the answer is yes, but at the moment there is no functionality to do it in an automatized way in FEEDNET.
Thank you very much, Luís. And I was saying, I think that's all about question, but we have another from Reda. If I conduct an experiment for 3 months and I want to use my data to make a simulation of 1 year to save time and costs, is it possible? Reda, yes, it's possible, and actually this would correspond to the use case that we showed yesterday. So you have a trial that is limited in time, and you want to extrapolate your outcomes of the trial for a longer term period. So you can do that with FEEDNETICS. Yes, you can, nevertheless, and just like Tomé said, it's important that you have these first 3 months of trials, because you should use it in a sense for complementing your trials. So yes, you can. And I guess we've answered all the questions that were open in the Q&A. And I hope that the questions we have addressed it properly. If not, just please send us an email asking for further clarifications. And so if there are no more questions, I think that is all, and I hope you are all have a clear idea now about how you can use FEEDNETICS. And please, we will follow up with for those that of you that registered for the 3 days. And thank you very much. And we are confident that you'll find it useful to complement your research. And we look forward to hear more from you. So thank you very much for this 2-day participation. And hope we see you in the near future. Thank you all.